Everyone and welcome. I'm Matt Waters. I'm a partner at Jordan Price Law Firm in Raleigh, and I'm very pleased to be joined along with my partner that you also see here on your screen with you, Hope Carmichael, for today's presentation. Thank you as always to CAI-NC for the opportunity to be here with you all today. And thank you to all of you who have taken time out of your day to be with us. That's very important. We're glad for you to be here with us. CAI and Leslie and Amy always do such a great job with these Law Day events, and Hope and I are very pleased to be a part of this one with you today. Today, Hope and I are going to talk to you about a new kind of virtual reality. Hope, what have you and I been saying since way back in 2020?
Virtual meetings are here to stay, Matt.
That's exactly right. And as you can see from our title slide, we mean it, and they really are. We're here today to talk about the changes in the meetings law, which have made our prophetic words a permanent fixture in all of your and your community association's lives. I'm batting leadoff today, and we'll cover with you the changes in the law, and Hope is going to come in as the cleanup hitter in the second half of today's presentation to give you all of everything you need to know to make your meetings work with the new law and give you all of our best practical tips for conducting a smooth and successful remote meeting. Before we can look into the present and future of remote meetings, though, we've got to go back to the future, if you will, to where we were before the pandemic and the remote meetings law came into being. This slide and the next few will build the foundation upon which we will expand with the new law. All right, so there's some basic points that we need to cover first in order to understand the new law. And it's important to keep these points in mind as we look at that new law. Remember, there are two basic types of meetings for any community association. There's a board meeting, of course, which we're not here to talk about today, and that's for the board. And then there are membership meetings to which all members are invited and entitled to attend. Now, within membership meetings, there are two types: the annual meeting or the regular meeting of the members and the special meeting. All of what we're here to talk about and present today will have the same basic application between annual meetings and special meetings, but our primary focus and discussion, of course, will be with the annual meeting, especially since that's what you all work on the most. Now, there is a requirement in 55A-7-01 mandating that your community association hold a meeting of the members annually. Your association's bylaws are the exact same and require an annual meeting of the members. Now, the bylaws for your association, especially for any of your associations that are born pre-pandemic, which are most of them, require, or at least sound as if they require, that the annual meeting be held upon a date, time, and location set in the bylaws. What I mean by that, first Monday of the month of March at 7 p.m. at whatever the location is set in the bylaws. Now, Hope and I and our team here at Jordan Price have always been consistent in our opinions that this is really a requirement, the violation of which carries no penalty. Your bylaws likely also, or your bylaws may say something like the meetings of the members shall be held at a place in Wake County as may be determined by the board of directors, so maybe a little bit more flexible. Either way, though, 55A-7-01 provides that the failure to hold an annual meeting at a time stated in or fixed in the bylaws does not affect the validity of the meeting and the business taken at that meeting. Next slide, please. So look, a global pandemic mixed with all of your annual meetings like oil and water. That I can tell you. All of those first and second quarter 2020 annual meetings are now fourth quarter annual meetings, and we know that for lots of reasons, including by how many of these meetings we host in the fourth quarter of the year now. You all heard a lot about executive orders, especially in 2020. Remember that the executive orders and restrictions put into place were out of concerns for community spread of COVID. And so there were indoor and outdoor gathering capacity limitations throughout 2020 and at least a part of 2021, and really an emphasis on social distancing, which made virtual, pardon the pun there, virtually impossible for any community association to hold an annual meeting of the members as your bylaws or 55A might require. However, the executive orders did eventually encourage the use of remote meetings for community associations, and that really is what set up and put into motion where we are today. So annual membership meetings morphed into this kind of hybrid. So if you did meetings with us, you know what I'm talking about, where the association employed a virtual town hall style meeting to share information, update the community, let the members see and hear from the board and answer questions. And then also the association conducted what we called then a meeting by mail. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how the pandemic morphed the membership meetings and how we inched closer to the remote meetings law that we have today. Again, there was this combination of a virtual town hall style meeting, either preceded by or followed by a meeting by mail. Now, was the virtual meeting, town hall style meeting required? No, we certainly recommended it though, that the association hold that meeting to be able to provide that information to your members and to let them see you and hear from you. Now, I bet Hope's going to talk to you a little bit later about some of why that virtual meeting may be required now as we look at application of the new laws and cementing of this hybrid approach. And I bet she's also going to talk about the timing of the action by written ballot, as it's called in the statute, in relation to the virtual component of the meeting. So I'm not going to cover those issues here, but I just want you to know that they're important with the new meeting laws.
And Matt, before you go on to the specific requirements of the new law, and while you're still talking about kind of historically what we've been doing in the last 2 years during the pandemic, it's an important thing, just so nobody gets confused. However you did your meetings, if you did a combination of virtual meeting, if you only did action by written ballot during those pandemic times, prior to September 1st of 2021, the effective date of this new law, one of the great things about the new law, which CAI lobbied through and did for all associations, is that there's a savings clause and it validates whatever methodology you used to conduct your meetings during the pandemic. So Matt's kind of told you what the norm was, but whatever it is that you did for your association, it was validated, everything's good, and you start with a clean slate September of 21.
Thanks, Hope. That's exactly right. And so 55A 708 has always been available to communities. Can you go back one more slide?
Sure.
So 55A 708 has always been available to community associations in its old form. That section allowed action or business of the association to be conducted, that could be conducted at an in-person meeting of the members, to be conducted by mailed ballot, mailed to all members and returned by a date and time certain for the purposes of determining quorum. Now, what about that language in the statute that reads, unless prohibited by the articles of incorporation or bylaws? Well, as you will see that it remains with the new law, I can tell you that that language in the articles of incorporation or bylaws would have to be very specific on meetings and even probably exclude the use of action by written ballot, or as you will see with the remote meetings law, exclude remote meetings to be effective. So not even the language you've all seen in your bylaws about the date and time and location of the annual meeting being at a physical location, for example, which I mentioned earlier, would be enough to exclude the use of an action by written ballot. Next slide. All right, so as Hope already mentioned, September 2021, House Bill 320, as you may have heard it called, became law finally. We've been talking about it, and now it's law. And as Hope mentioned too, our firm, as you may know, or if you don't know, our firm is the lobbyist for CAI, and our own Weldon Jones helped navigate House Bill 320 to fruition, and again, make Hope and I sound like we actually do have crystal balls in our offices. Sometimes I'm convinced she actually does have a crystal ball in her office, and I'm still working to refine mine. I'm also currently the chair of the Community Associations Committee at the North Carolina Bar Association Real Property Section and serve on the council. And so I worked a little bit with the section to support that remote meeting law. So I did have a little bit of behind the scenes help in making sure my crystal ball actually worked. House Bill 320 and the new law that we're here to talk about today really made the critical changes or additions, if you will, to the existing law on membership meetings. And that's why we're here. The key changes or additions are really found that we're going to talk about the most today anyway, are found in 55A-708, which now reads member action by written ballot or electronic voting without a meeting. And that's the part, the underlying part, which is the new part. And then 55A-709, which is brand spanking new, and which is called a remote participation in meetings or meetings held solely by remote participation. These are the two chief sections, again, of the statute that I want to talk about. And Hope mentioned, and I want to just reemphasize it, that the savings provision saves whatever methodology you used last year or the year before. Next slide, please. All right, so 55A-708, remember, that's the action by written ballot, but now also includes an electronic voting allowance. So the action by written or electronic ballot is allowed unless prohibited or limited by the Articles of Incorporation or bylaws. Or to state that another way, there's no amendment needed for your bylaws or articles in order to implement these new laws. So the law begins with basically the same premise as before, House Bill 320, talking about an action that may be taken at a meeting of the members, may be taken without a meeting by written ballots or electronic voting, or both. So there's no meaningful change in how the written ballots are distributed and collected. It's done all just like you've done before. Keep in mind that unless your bylaws require secret balloting, the ballots that you send out to all of your members, they've got to contain information sufficient to identify the member or the member's proxy submitting the ballot. So I'll get more about proxies in a bit, but that's an important note to keep in mind. And if your bylaws do require secret balloting, Hope and I can talk to you about how to handle the written ballot voting process. Now, if electronic voting, here's the first big change, okay? So long as a member has first designated the email address to be used for communication and business between that member and the association, and provided any other information required by the association to facilitate communication and business conducted by electronic means, then the association may provide an electronic ballot which provides instructions and an opportunity to vote. Now I'm going to get to, and I know Hope is wanting me to get to, I'm going to talk about what that exchange of information is going to look like and what's needed there. So next slide, please. So it's really entirely within the board's discretion as to whether to allow the written ballots, electronic or both. However, electronic voting cannot be the exclusive method of voting unless all members, that's key, all members have complied with 55A-1-70 in the exchange of information. Remember, the exchange of information, that's what's important. And no, just because a member emails one of you to ask a question about why the pool hours cannot be extended later into the year, or to complain about the sod dying over there in the common area, does not mean that the member has complied with or consented with the requirements to conduct business electronically. There's got to be a more direct, express, and really, I don't know if you agree with me, I really think the best place to insert this process would really be at the closing table when a new member is buying into the community, with some exchange of information, a form signed by the buyer, acknowledging and providing that consent and that information needed and required by the association in order to conduct business electronically.
That's a great suggestion, Matt, but what I want to tell folks, because there are a lot of opinions out there, and so we're of course here to give you our best opinions. I think that is an excellent way proactively and going forward to try and collect those email addresses. But what is the most common way that you would receive an email address that a member has designated for the purpose of conducting business with the association is on that website where the member wants to make online payments of assessments, asks for copies of electronic assessment statements and account statements for past due assessments, or even registers on a community website to receive copies of newsletters and notices of board meetings and copies of minutes and e-blasts that the association sends out. Those are all things that the association does to conduct its business. So do you have to have a written, I give you permission to use this email address for the purpose of sending me a meeting notice? In my opinion, you do not. What the statute says is an email address that has been designated for the purpose of conducting business with the association. If that business is paying assessments, that's probably the most frequent business that somebody does conduct with the association. So I take a broad view of that designation of email address. And I think honestly, that's what benefits members. They want to communicate electronically. They don't open their mail. Service by US mail, probably we need to move to eliminating that as quickly as possible. So I probably have a different view than many of you have heard, and that's okay because there are other views out there. And mine is not the most conservative, I'll tell you that, but mine is probably the most facilitating to use these electronic means of communication.
That's right. All right, so quorum is still determined by the number of votes, whether it's written, electronic, or both, received by the deadline. And one more note about the deadlines. So a written ballot is deemed valid if it's received by the deadline, and an electronic vote is valid if it's cast by the deadline. Next slide, Hope. All right, now, even though I can't really see any of you out there right now, I can tell that you're catching on right now. You're catching on with the fact that the statute says a written ballot or electronic voting without a meeting. And so you're remembering that I said in the first slide, I think it was the first slide or the second slide of the presentation, that the association has to have an annual meeting. So now what? So while you can do everything I just said you can do, your association still must have an annual meeting of the members. So how are you going to do that? Here's the difference though. Between now and 2020, and at least part of 2021, number one, there are no executive orders which encourage virtual meetings. And number two, there's this new remote meetings law, which while it makes things permanent, there are some tricky applications and important parts to understand. So now to have your annual meeting, you could either go back to the good old days before the pandemic when Hope and I would ride up on our horse and carriage to your clubhouse or your church down the road for your annual meeting, or you can take advantage of the remote meeting law. Next slide, please.
I feel like that was a personal slur, Matt.
No. That's how far back. That's how far back it's been since this pandemic started. It seems. It just seems like it's been going on for so long. All right, so remote meetings of the members are allowed so long as you've got these two key points covered. They're authorized by the board of directors and subject to the guidelines and procedures that the board adopts. I bet Hope's probably going to go over some of that second point, but we recommend you talk to your association's attorney for guidance on guidelines and procedures because that's important. So a member is deemed present and may vote at the meeting if the association has implemented reasonable measures, and there's two requirements here, okay, to verify that each member is actually a member and provide the members a reasonable opportunity to vote and participate, just like if this was an in-person meeting at the clubhouse or the church down the street. So here's the reality, all right? The reality is that many of your communities just simply aren't set up yet to accommodate a meeting held solely under 55A-709, but Hope's going to walk you through how to start to get there and how to make that easier for you. Next slide, please. All right, so remote meetings can be the sole means of participation only if, all right, so this means just that virtual component in conducting all of your business and doing everything in that virtual meeting. Only if, number one, again, you keep hearing this, you've heard it a lot already today, not prohibited by your articles of incorporation or bylaws. Number two, the board decides that it is the case in its sole discretion, that's how the meeting's going to be conducted. And number three, only if the association has implemented those reasonable measures that I talked about on the last slide. So there's some specific notice requirements too for your meeting notice. It's got to contain all of the information that your meeting notices always contain, but it's got to also provide in there that the meeting is going to be held solely by remote means and instructions on how that member is going to join that meeting and also participate. Next slide, please. All right, quorum and proxies. Get lots of questions about this, and so I know that this is an important slide that I want to cover. All right, there's no change in the requirement that the association must have a quorum present at a meeting of the members. This is whether it's a in-person meeting or a virtual meeting, doesn't matter. There's got to be a quorum if there's going to be business conducted. All right, so the reality right now, again, as I said, is that unless your association is set up and has measures to verify that each person in attendance is a member or the member's proxy, you're probably not going to be able to meet quorum, and there will be no voting at the remote meeting. And this is really typically not a problem for some of you anyway, because you have turnout below that quorum threshold anyway. All right, so you're asking now, have we even had a meeting and satisfied that requirement that you've been telling me all day, Matt? You've been saying that your bylaws and the articles of incorporation and the statute says you got to have an annual meeting. Have we actually even had a meeting? We don't have or cannot determine or meet quorum. So Hope and I and our team take the collective position that you have satisfied your meeting requirement by having a remote meeting, virtual Zoom meeting, whatever the case may be, coupled with the action by written ballot, regardless of whether you have a quorum at your virtual meeting, your Zoom meeting component. All right, so here's the big takeaway for all of this, for all of what I've been talking about before I get to my final point today. All right, remember earlier when I said that the virtual component in 2020 and 2021 was not really required or necessary, but it was recommended. We recommended it to all of our clients that you still have that virtual component, even when many of you said, we just really don't like Zoom, don't want to do it. Well, if your community is not set up to conduct a meeting solely by remote means, it is a necessity now, we think, in order to couple with the action by written or electronic balloting to satisfy that meeting requirement. Again, you need to have kind of this hybrid approach to be able to conduct your meeting remotely and comply with the law on having a meeting of an annual meeting of the members. All right, so final point before I turn things over to Hope, proxies. Get lots of questions about proxies. There are at least two potential scenarios where this could be important, all right? So at the actual virtual meeting, if you have a quorum and are otherwise allowing remote participation, or with the action by written ballot. So in the first example, or the first instance where this could arise, here's the classic way that it might be used. If somebody maybe isn't technologically capable or doesn't have the means to connect to the meeting remotely, you might have a proxy show up at that remote meeting for that member to participate in that meeting. The second way, action by written ballot. Now, this isn't used as much, but here's how it could come up. Perhaps if during the mail balloting process, the member is out of the area, maybe stationed overseas, just in around to collect mail or to otherwise receive a mail written ballot or electronic balloting and has no way to return one, there may be a proxy used to return that written ballot. But proxies still are, there's a re-emphasis on proxies with this new law. So I want everybody to keep that in mind. So that's the new law. That's the requirements that have been set out by House Bill 320 and the remote meetings law. And so now I'm going to turn things over to my partner, Hope, to talk about how all this is actually going to work in practice.
Thanks, Matt. So my job is to get us down to business. How do we go about doing this? And it dawned on me that what I did not put in my slides, the single most frequent question I'm getting is, but should we have it virtually or should we have it in person? And you're going to have half the community that does not like Zoom and wants to get together. I would posit to you, are those the people who want an opportunity to shout and complain? Or do they just like being social? That's certainly a possibility. And you're going to have another part of the community that is maybe even not saying this out loud, but they really enjoy the convenience of being able to have dinner at home, put the kids upstairs in the playroom. Both husband and wife can join the meeting, that they don't have to drive anywhere, that the association is not having to pay $500 to rent the fellowship hall at the local church to hold the meeting. There are a lot of reasons for the board to consider doing these meetings virtually. But what I will tell you in our experience, and as a firm, We have conducted well over 1,000 virtual annual meetings for associations over the last 2.5 years, I guess. By far, we are hearing that the participation on the virtual meeting is higher than the numbers of people who are showing up. So it is inviting more people in your community to participate. We were very worried at one time about people in the neighborhood who were not tech savvy and could they join and all of that. I think that as the whole world has progressed through this pandemic, those concerns are not really being a reality. And everyone has a telephone. And so the new law really takes into consideration that telephonic participation in addition to participation online. So I'm not saying which you should do, but I'm saying that's what the board should be thinking about in making the decision. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and that's especially the case for your resort communities, right? Your resort communities are going to be able to have way more participation in meetings when they're conducted by this remote process, rather than waiting for Memorial Day or some holiday when you typically have more of your members in town for your to set aside time to do your meeting then in person.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that pandemic concerns are not still going to be a factor in whether or not to have your meetings, but as we hopefully come out of the pandemic and we have more vaccinations and COVID is not as much a threat to public health, there are other reasons to consider having your meetings virtually, and that's the reason that CAI was so excited about getting this law passed in North Carolina. So it's there for you to use, take advantage of it, don't be afraid of it. I'm going to tell you how to use it to your advantage and give you some practical tips. Big takeaway, fully virtual annual meetings are now allowed unless specifically prohibited in the articles or the bylaws, and if allowed by the board. It's 100% in the board's discretion. As Matt said, the board must implement reasonable measures for member participation. That is in red, and I know you hate it when lawyers tell you reasonable, because there is no definition you can go look at in a book for reasonable. It's like pornography. We know it when we see it, right? But we're going to talk about ways to protect yourself on that and what we believe goes into that reasonable determination. The board, as Matt said, I was going to talk about this. The new law says the board may adopt meeting guidelines and procedures. That is my favorite part of this law. The board can say anything they want about how the virtual meeting is going to be conducted. People have to use the raise their hand feature. People, are going to be only called on once. People are going to have to put their names, identify themselves by name when they join the virtual meeting. You cannot join anonymously. If you join anonymously or you don't identify the telephone number that you're calling in from, you will be dismissed from the meeting. You will only have 2 minutes to speak, and the chair will have the ability to mute you after that. Put all of that in your meetings and guidelines, and the statute specifically allows the board the flexibility to do that. I think that's a great feature for the new law.
Or
And your meeting, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
or if you're going to let people, if you are going to let, when you're letting people talk, put a timer. You can, share screen, put a timer up on the screen and limit the amount of time people have to talk.
Yeah. And there is additional information that your meeting notice must contain, and we're going to talk about that. So how can we vote electronically? Matt talked a lot about this hybrid option, and I'm going to tell you that we still recommend, as a best practice, and frankly the most affordable practice for the vast majority of community associations in North Carolina, is that voting by written ballot, which can be emailed. Okay, that's not the same thing as electronic voting. Electronic voting is having a system. The systems are quite expensive. It's like an app on your phone where you just click a button and you're voting for Matt Waters and Hope Carmichael for the 2 vacant director positions. To have live electronic voting, you must have an electronic mail address for everyone in the association. So that's going to knock out a lot of people right there. Secondly, to have a system that provides for all the safeguards that the statute requires. Ensure that there are no duplicate ballots. Ensure that the person submitting the ballot is a member. Ensure that there's no voter fraud, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing when I say that. You are going to have to pay for one of these software systems that are in the thousands to sign up to do that. So that really knocks out, from a budget perspective, a lot of associations. That's the should we part. And is it reasonable to only vote online? Is for your community, are there enough people that you're worried about that either object to that or don't have good access to Wi-Fi and broadband technology, that really is disenfranchising a portion of your community? That's why we've got this worried little question mark here. The board needs to think through that and decide what's best for your community. So what types of remote participation are allowed? This is the other big question I get. Can we require that everybody submit only written questions and not allow people to speak? This is the big change in the new law, in my opinion. The law says you must allow members, whatever means a platform you're using for a remote meeting, you must allow members an opportunity to communicate and to read or hear the proceedings of the meeting substantially concurrently with the proceedings. So can they participate by telephone, an online platform? Here's the big problem. You must provide members a reasonable opportunity to participate in the meeting and to vote to the same extent they could if they were present in person. Well, if they were present in person, they could speak, right? And I think that's the big distinction about, you got to get off the permanent mute button. You got to allow people to raise their hand. You got to recognize people to speak. Absolutely put a time limit on it. You can still have a lot more control in the virtual meeting from meetings going downhill and being chaotic. But it is my recommendation that you have to let people speak. Matt, would you agree?
Yeah, and now, I mean, what about that guy that's, inevitably the member that pops up at some point says, well, I was running late from work and I couldn't get home to my computer and I was only able to join by telephone and I just couldn't participate because I was on my phone. Well, my view on that is that, that's really like that member showing up late to an in-person meeting or missing that in-person meeting. And it's really not the association's problem if that member chose to join the meeting by phone, could have possibly joined another way, but was running late or something. And, you get that complaint. And I really don't think that that's an association issue.
Yeah. So here's what you need to do to solve that reasonableness dilemma, right? You have to check in the participants and verify that each member participating as a member is a member. Is that practical when everybody's joining a Zoom meeting in 5 minutes for your manager or the board secretary to be looking at everybody who's joining, and somebody's joined as Hot Mama 36, and how are you going to figure all that out? What we say you need to do is use a system that requires you to register ahead of time so that you have full opportunity to see who's registered, and people are only getting a link to join the meeting if they have appropriately registered and been vetted as a member to join the meeting. You must accept and account for proxies. Matt went over that. You must be able to verify, if you're going to vote during the meeting, that the members there are constituting a quorum. I submit to you the reason that the best practice is the hybrid of the action by written ballot and then the remote meeting for the informational part of your meeting is because you have a lot more control over ensuring quorum by the written ballot. And then you don't have to worry about how many people show up on the Zoom on the night of the meeting. So again, I can't say this enough, provide members a reasonable opportunity to participate just as they could if they were present in person. Again, that's the got to be a little more flexible with the mute button. You must prevent the casting of duplicate or unauthorized votes if you're voting during the meeting. And you must observe Robert's rules unless you've written your own rules and procedures for the meeting. Another good reason for the board to have a special resolution with rules for your association for the virtual meeting, because you can really tailor it to what works best for you. Again, what's reasonable? The answer is not the same for all associations. The participation methods must be reasonable. I think that means you have to allow a call-in number by telephone as well as joining online. The communications options must be reasonable. How do you recognize members? Are people allowed to unmute themselves and talk over each other? Does that allow for the conduct of a good meeting? I think that's somewhat problematic. And
well, you wouldn't have members just shouting and talking over one another in a in-person meeting.
Right. Or you might, and that might be the reason that you want to have that virtual technology. But again, be judicious with that mute button. And any voting options must be reasonable. Is it reasonable to use the raise the hand feature to vote in an association of 20 townhomes? Yes, probably it is. Is it reasonable to use the raise the hand feature to vote in an 1,800 lot planned community? Absolutely not. Okay, so you gotta tailor that for your association. How do you avoid liability? Because we all worry about that one person who is determined to sue you, or who's going to make your life miserable because they're threatening to sue you if you don't do it right. Again, think carefully about your membership and what's reasonable for your membership. One size does not fit all. Make sure that what you have as your primary driver is inclusivity. Your goal is to allow everybody and as many people as possible to participate. Adopt those guidelines and procedures and publicize them in advance. I recommend, and we're going to see this kind of step-by-step that I developed, that you send them out with your meeting notice. And again, it's my recommendation that the best practice is that hybrid approach. Meet remotely to inform and discuss, take nominations from the floor at that virtual meeting, if that's what your bylaws call for, and then cast votes for election of directors. If you're doing a special assessment vote, if you're voting to amend the covenants, do all of that by written ballot, so there's no confusion and there's no allegation that somebody has been disenfranchised because you conducted the voting during a remote meeting. That's probably going to be the best practice for the majority of associations.
Going back to that last slide and thinking about being proactive and inclusive of your members, how are you addressing the question that's coming up to all of us about whether the association should hold both at the same time, an in-person and a virtual meeting at the clubhouse with some technology?
Yeah, Matt, what I do represent a couple of associations who have invested, over $20,000 in setting up what's called a Zoom room at their clubhouse, so that honestly the technology is good enough to have that hybrid meeting. People who are online can see everybody who's in the room. They can hear everybody who's in the room. Everybody who's in the room, there's a large enough screen, can hear and see people who are online. But unless you've invested in that technology and you're trying to do it with shoddy Wi-Fi or questionable Wi-Fi that might be, going in and out, somebody's holding up a phone to try and capture a picture of everybody in the audience, you are not giving the same participation opportunity to the people who are in the room and the people who are online. It's just unavoidable that the people in the room are going to have more access to the people who are running the meeting than the people online. And that's why I worry about the hybrid approach, or why I worry about a joint Zoom and in-person meeting. I think it can be done, but I think you've really got to invest in the technology that's going to make it an equivalent experience for people who are there in person and people online. Thanks for asking that, Matt, because we do get that question a lot. And what I want to say about that is, when people ask me that, I say, there's no way you're going to make everybody happy, and it's the board's job to make the best decision it can with the data that's available to it. So if you're trying to do both an in-person and a Zoom meeting because you're trying to make everybody happy, you're probably going to end up making everybody unhappy. So you just need to make the best decision for one or the other, in my opinion. The software that you use for the remote meeting, you must allow the meeting chair to keep order. So you need a mute button, right? And if the chair of your meeting, if there are few enough participants that a Zoom meeting will work, then Zoom meeting is fine. Again, I think that's that 20-member townhome meeting versus the large, 100+. You probably need to use something that is able to have more order kept than just a Zoom meeting. Does everybody have that option to call in by phone? Can everybody participate? Can participants signal to be recognized? There is a way, and I will look this up and try to put this in the chat when we do this presentation live. There is a star, some number during Zoom that you can press on your phone to raise your hand. So participants can signal that they want to be recognized to speak. And I just can't remember which number it is. I'll look that up and put it in the chat. Do designate one person whose sole job it is to run the tech, even whether it's a Zoom meeting or not, whether that's you call Jordan Price and ask us to host a meeting for you, whether there's somebody from the management team who is doing that, whether there's a board member who's particularly tech savvy who's able to do that. Don't make the person who's chairing the meeting also have to run the tech. Don't make your manager, who's trying to listen out for questions and give the manager's report and present the budget, also responsible for running the tech. That's a recipe for a poorly run meeting. For electronic voting, again, all of those things we talked about that you must ensure. I have some associations that have in their bylaws that cumulative voting will be allowed. Boy, that's really something you have to think about when you are talking to software vendors. How do you allow for cumulative voting? That's not normal, but I do have some associations that have that in their bylaws. And you need to ask your software company on this electronic voting if all of these things are covered and if they are compliant with the statute.
Oh, by the way, the neat thing about this kind of presentation is that your partner, when you ask a question like that, can Google something on his phone and find out that *9 is, as what the internet tells me, is what you would press to raise your hand on the phone in a Zoom meeting.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. I see now Leslie put it in the chat too, so that's great. Again, ask the software vendor, don't assume. Do consult with your lawyer and advise your members if there's any additional information that you need from them. Advise them in the meeting notice what they're going to have to do when they register for that virtual meeting. All right, step by step, okay? First thing, adopt that board policy with special rules to conduct remote membership meetings. Contact our office. We have developed those for several associations. Contact your own legal counsel. I'm sure lawyers all across the state are doing this because my colleagues in other firms and other cities across North Carolina really love that provision in the new law as well. Number two, send the meeting notice out to the members. Your bylaws still apply. How many days must you give notice before the meeting? The bylaws are going to dictate that. You can send email notice instead of US mail. to anyone who has designated an email address with the association for the purpose of conducting business. I went over that before. Explain that nominations for directors, if that is allowed under your bylaws, will be taken from the audience at the virtual meeting. That's your nominations from the floor process. During the pandemic, we were kind of shortcutting that, cutting some corners and saying, well, the write-in on the ballot allowed for the nominations from the floor. I think since September of 21, with this new meeting, we really have to honor those provisions in the bylaws if nominations are allowed from the floor, and do that in the meeting. That's part of people being able to participate to the same extent that they would if they were present in person. So get away from that nominations from the floor or the write-in box. And I know you're going to have to send this. My best practice requires you to send 2 mailings. It is well worth the cost. And the fact that you can use email now for a vast majority of the notices you're sending instead of all that US mail is going to save you money. It is worth the 2 mailings to do it the right way. If you don't take anything else away from what I said today, I hope you'll take that away. You include the registration information for your electronic meeting in your meeting notice and the call-in number, and you include a copy of those special rules that the board adopted for conducting the virtual meeting. Watch the registrations. Make sure people are registering, that nothing went wrong. If you get to 5 days before your meeting and you've got 0 registrations, something's wrong. I do encourage you to send email reminders because people forget. People are thinking, well, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to make it or not, and they'll wait to the last minute. So it's a good practice to send email reminders. Again, if you set up a meeting with us and we're running the meeting for you, we have a staff person that monitors those things 15 days before the meeting, 8 days before the meeting. We have benchmarks set, and they are emailing the manager and saying, you know, only 3 people have registered for this meeting. You might want to send an email reminder. So that does happen, and we've seen that happen. Step 4, go ahead and conduct your annual meeting on the date you set via Zoom or some other technology. Again, that webinar platform as opposed to the meeting platform is going to be best if you think you're going to have more than 25, maybe I would even say 40 people, okay? If, again, you might have 20 lots and only have 8 people on the meeting. You might have 50 lots and only have 20 people on the meeting. But if you have more than 100 lots in your association, you really need to be thinking about a webinar platform where only the board is visible, like we're coming to you today, as opposed to the Zoom meeting where you have 100 people on a screen at one time. Do allow members to unmute and speak. Have a rule set aside for how that happens. Require any anonymous attendees to list their name, or they will be dismissed from the meeting. You should include that in those rules that you adopted as step 1. The platform, the Zoom platform, keeps the order in which people raise their hands, so it automatically ranks, you know, when you need to call on people and in what order. And you don't sweat the quorum for the virtual meeting if you're doing the best practice, the Hope Carmichael, Matt Waters method, right? Because the quorum is going to be important in the action that is taken, whether that's to elect directors, you know, to ratify the budget, if you have some other vote that you're conducting. The law in North Carolina says that the lack of a quorum is only a problem if there is action to be taken, not in terms of having that informational meeting. So do add any new nominations. Do take nominations from the floor at that virtual meeting. Add any new nominations to the written ballot and send that out via email and US mail, depending on whether you have a designated email address. The ballot must include the deadline date for return. It can be returned by hand delivery, US mail, email, fax. Regardless of how the owner received it, they can return it any of those methodologies. I would say consider using postcards, particularly if you're worried about people returning it and making quorum. And the quorum is determined by the number of ballots received. And that's why you have to have a date certain.
What about the member who decides that he's going to usurp the voting process and he's going to intercept the ballots, or he's going to create his own ballot and he's going to start passing those out? He's going to start soliciting ballots. He's going to perform his own write-in campaign, and he's going to solicit ballots from as many members as he can, and he's sending things around and telling people just to scribble their name on the ballot, return it to him, and he'll deliver those ballots in to the association.
Yeah, the ballots that you send out are going to have to be verified that they are received by a member and have unique identifiers for the members. So that's still important for the process. And Matt, that might be an advanced question for 202. I see we're at 53 minutes.
Yeah.
The final step is tally the ballots and announce the election or voting results. That doesn't require a third mailing. I get that question a lot too. Sending out an e-blast, putting it in the newsletter, posting it on your website is fine. So there is some time now for your questions. Matt, thanks for all your good information. Enjoyed being with you today, everybody, and enjoy Law Day.
Likewise, Hope, and thank you, everybody, for being with us today.